Data scientist was supposed to be the job of the century. So why does everyone seem to be rebranding to analytics engineer now? I remember when I was actually studying, and I studied data and AI specifically, and the big title that all of my teachers would mention and everyone seemed to want to become was data scientist. But I think this title has been taking a bit of a hit recently, and I would even argue that among all of the data titles, that's one of the hardest ones to find a job in, especially if you don't really have any concrete work experience yet. And a big reason for that is that I think it's become a bit squeezed by two other titles that have become a bit newer, and it's the ML engineer title that specifically works with machine learning, something super important, obviously now with AI, but already before that. And on the more technical ex-business side, which was another aspect of the data scientist, it's now analytics engineer that seems to be the title that takes over. And I've seen that myself because obviously I didn't choose to become a data scientist. That was one of the options. After I studied, I chose to go down the data engineering roles because the qualifications for that more aligned with what I wanted to do. But I still see on LinkedIn people I graduated with and people I've worked with before also that recently started rebranding and kind of moved away from data science, except if they obviously built a very in-depth knowledge about that field. But I've seen a lot of people move away from that title. And I think analytics engineer is the role that I've seen pop up the more in, I would say, the last year and a half. I even have a lot of people that were also data engineers like me that are now analytics engineers. And I think it's a very interesting title. I would even say now that it exists, one of my first jobs, if I read the description of what an analytics engineer does versus what I did at that job, even though I was technically a data engineer, that was the title that the company gave me, I think it would qualify way more closely now to analytics engineer. And so I think it's interesting to take a look at the title and see if there's anything actually interesting or if it's just a rebranding of something that existed before. So the first thing to look at is, why did this title suddenly pop up? And I think a big reason for that is the emergence of the modern data stack, something very, very important, and that almost any company now is at least trying to move forward, and a lot of startups and upcoming company, that's where they start their data stack on. And more specifically, I'm thinking about dbt because I think the analytics engineer itself is basically knowing how to use dbt. Obviously, dbt has been around for, in my opinion, longer than I've seen the analytics engineer title be around too, but it has really become one of those central data tool that everyone should know in the field. When you have such a predominant tool in an industry, obviously there are going to be roles that emerge around that specific tool. I think also because now every company's strategy is basically AI oriented. Obviously, there are some exceptions to this, but I think it would be a shame to completely ignore the rise of AI recently. And AI, something very important for it to work well, is to have clean data, which makes even more sense that the role of analytics engineer would rise, because obviously the main goal of that role is kind of to sit somewhere in between the super technical aspect. Obviously, you need to know SQL, Python, dbt, all of those things, but you also need to be close to the business and what the business needs, and you're kind of the link between super technical people and super businessy people and the facilitator between those things. And I think it's also a role that reminds me a lot of the emergence of the product owner and product manager for more typical software engineering jobs that kind of sit in that in between business and technical. Obviously, POs and PMs can be or can't be very technical. That obviously depends on the company, but there's really a thing of a technical PM. And I think in some ways, analytics engineers is a little bit like that for data, because I think it's a very common frustration between technical teams and business teams that sometimes our goals are a little bit different and it's hard to align on something, because obviously technical people are very focused on the technique, and sometimes it can feel for the business team that the technical team is limiting their ability because they're always giving technical reasons as to why we can't do something. And while that maybe something very valuable, I think sometimes the communication between those two entities is a bit hard. And a big part, in my opinion, of the analytics engineer role is to really ease up those relations and make it seem like the technical team is also aligned with the business team, and also to kind of relieve the very, very technical people from having to communicate in those like very frustration-based rounds with the business team. Another thing I think that is very important to talk about specifically here is not just DBT, but also the semantic layer. And it's something that now in most companies is being implemented, specifically as it's related to AI. And I think this is because it's a new layer added. It needs owners and it needs people that master that part of the code base, and that's exactly what an analytics engineer is supposed to do. By the way, if none of these words mean anything to you, then maybe you should consider following my newsletter. There'll be a link at the top of the description, because I try to explain those terms and try to keep you up to date to everything data and tech related. So definitely consider giving it a go. So then the second part of my analysis is trying to take a look at who is becoming an analytics engineer, because from what I've seen, at least, not many people necessarily become analytics engineer like straight after school. It's more a sort of rebranding position, or if you realize that you have roles that have been aligning with the description of that new role, you might become an analytics engineer. But it's interesting to take a look at exactly what the different cases are. So I mostly see two options, basically before. So you had the data scientist. I think those mostly become ML engineers now. Very rarely do they become analyst engineers, but it's mostly interesting for data analysts and data engineer, because basically an analytics engineer is almost like somewhere in the middle also between those two roles, and it's skills that are very easily transferable from both positions to the analytics engineer, so it's going to be easier to transition to. So for analysts, it usually means getting better at the technical part, especially trying to learn a bit more than just SQL and dashboards. Obviously, I'm simplifying what analysts know, but it usually means upskilling a bit in like Python and scripting and obviously DBT. And I think it's an especially interesting move for analysts because on average, I mean, maybe this is a bit unfortunate, but the analytics engineers do earn more than the average data analyst. So it's a very, very money-wise interesting move to make as a data analyst. So definitely, if you're a data analyst watching this, you should consider taking a look into the role of analytics engineer, and if it's something you'd be interested in doing first, obviously, and then just, look at the possible pay raise you'd be getting from this. On the other side, for the data engineers, I think this can resonate a lot with data engineers that are obviously super technical, but maybe are super interested in the business side and, feel like sometimes the very technical role of data engineer kind of gets them stuck in the tech part and doesn't allow them to maybe contribute a bit faster to what the business might did, and also just want to learn that new aspect of their career. I think it's definitely an interesting move also in that way, because it makes you closer to the business. But I think for data engineers, it doesn't necessarily give you a huge pay raise or a big difference. So it's also maybe slightly more of a risky move, because I think data engineers are not going anywhere. It's still like a super relevant role. But obviously, if you're thinking about leaving a bit the tech space or getting a bit further away from it, I think it's a very, very interesting move to make. Now the question on everyone's lips is, will this title actually last? Obviously, I have no crystal ball to see what's going to happen in the future, so it's just going to be my opinion, which is purely speculative, and I'm very interested in knowing your opinion actually, so feel free to leave those in the comments. But in my opinion, I think it has a good chance of lasting a while, because it does answer some very specific frustrations that I've seen in my own career between the business and the data team. And I think it's, I've been in teams before with analytics engineers, and I think they get sometimes a bit more respect, unfortunately, from like the data engineers, because they have a bit more of a technical knowledge than the analysts do. So I think it's definitely a very good bridging role. And as data is becoming such a central part of every tech company, it only makes sense that more roles in the data field would appear. But I do have some like counter arguments to that theory that it is a title that is gonna last. The first one is how intimately tied it is as of right now to a specific tool, because I've mentioned a lot of times, I think, through this video, how related this title is to DBT. So I think if DBT, even though it is not going anywhere anytime soon, in my opinion, if DBT does happen to start disappearing, I wonder if this will also impact that role, because if a completely different tool appears, then the analytics engineer skill might not be as transferable to that new tool, and then the role might probably disappear. Also, if you're mostly interested in working for small companies and startup, I think it is interesting to know that it is still a pretty limited role in my opinion, and in those environments, in my experience, the data team is pretty limited, which means that focusing on that title might not be the easiest, because it's more like of a in-between role when you have like a full modern data stack that is deployed. And so I think it is going to be rarer to find in startups for now, because it might not be as essential as, for instance, a data engineer might be, or a BI analyst might be. But obviously, I mean, it still exists in startup, but I think it's also important to know that maybe if you're interested more in the startup space, maybe it is not the most like prominent role that you will find in those spaces. So after all this talk about theory, what I think you should do is, especially if you're a data analyst, I think it's definitely a very interesting sort of change to make and a smart career move, also because you're just gonna learn more technical stuff, which I think is always easy to learn, especially since those tools and this modern data stack is still relatively new. It's better to get into that space now than later when you have people that have like 10 years of experience on it. Not saying you have to switch titles or roles, obviously, but just saying it's something that you might want to look into. And if you're a data engineer, I actually think you should look into the analytics engineer tasks and knowledge in business, especially if you're in a smaller organization, because that might actually be expected of you, even if your title is data engineer. So it's always good to, not be too far away from what the business did, because at the end of the day, your company probably makes decision based on the business. And it's always good to, expand your range of skills. But at the end of the day, a title is just a title, and what matters more is the tools that you know and the knowledge that you have. So those are the things that you should keep investing in. And for instance, I think a common trap right now would be to absolutely want this analytics engineer title without taking that much interest into the actual tools and skills that you need, and kind of do it the other way, which I think is the wrong way. You should learn the tools first and then look into the title. You don't want to stick yourself into a title but then not have the very, very in-depth knowledge about it, and then later on, if the title does disappear, it will be harder to switch to something else. And for that, I think a good way is just to not just look at LinkedIn posts that I think are talking a lot about the analytics engineer role, but also just, take a good old look at the job postings themselves, because at the end of the day, you want the title that companies are hiring for. So if you found this video interesting, I think you'd definitely be interested in subscribing to my newsletter by clicking the link below. And with that being said, I will see you in the next video.